Hey, everyone. Thank you for coming to the first ever meeting of the Red Hook Blazer and Sweaters Appreciation Society. I'm Isaac Butler. We're gonna talk a little bit. We're gonna see a couple scenes. We're gonna talk about those scenes. It's gonna be a yabadoo time. So I want to obviously talk to Will and Emma about the project, but before we get to this, Michael has specifically asked that I ask Rhodri to, for those of you for whom it's been a while since you've read or seen Hamlet, can you give us, a 50-word plot summary? No, I'm kidding. If you could give us a brief preface on the play to open.
Okay, I'll try. So there's an unhappy Danish prince who lives in a country and is a prince in a country where the monarch is elected rather than born. His father has died early when the unhappy prince is on his way to college in Wittenberg, which is probably a 10-day to 3-week fast horse ride away. At some point there, he is called back to discover not only that he has not been anointed, touched, as it were, as the king, but that his uncle is now the king, who he doesn't like very much, and his mother has also married him. So he's rather unhappy about his lot, but doesn't really have many outs through which he can express that unhappiness because, it would be treasonous in various different ways. As luck would have it, his father's ghost is on hand to explain that, in fact, Dad did not die an innocent death bitten by a snake in his hammock in Denmark, but that he was murdered by said uncle Claudius. And Hamlet is then given this mission to avenge this horrible wrong. The problem is that he doesn't really feel it. He knows that he ought to be really preoccupied with the business of finding a way of getting at Claudius and then killing him, much as, say, Laertes will do later in the play when he discovers that Polonius has been killed. But actually he's too wrapped up in his own anger, his own issues, his own feelings of frustration, not the least of which, I think, this is getting away from Précy, I apologize, but I'm stuck now, is that his father has not nominated him as heir, which he could have done, as Claudius does very quickly. So there are mixed emotions, and rather than confront those, Hamlet tries on different ways of behaving as a revenger, as a lover, as a theatre director of sorts, as a revenger, and then all other options kind of being exhausted as the self-anointed agent of God. Discuss. Anyway, the play doesn't work as a way of proving Claudius's guilt to anybody else apart from Hamlet. Hamlet gets very cross about it, is dragged to talk to his mother, who wants to find out what's really going on. He kills Polonius, the king's chief courtier, in error. He gets banished to England. He discovers that Claudius has sent his friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern with a letter to have the English king kill him. On arrival in England, he switches out this letter to have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern killed. There is some business with pirates, which no one really understands, and he ends up back in Denmark, now even more convinced than ever that he is the agent of divine vengeance in various different ways. Has an argument with Laertes about who loved Ophelia most. Laertes' attempted rebellion against Claudius is talked down by Claudius. Claudius says, it's not me, it's that dreadful nephew of mine. Let's kill him together. We'll figure it all out, and then you'll have your restitution. That all goes wrong. Everyone ends up dead, with the exception of Horatio, Osric, and a couple of sort of inconsequential souls, and the kingdom is handed over to the sort of bloodthirsty, killing for kicks Norwegian princeling, from whom they've been trying to keep it all play long.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So one of the of course, shot through that is this very complicated relationship between Hamlet and Ophelia, who is Polonius's daughter. And I know, and we're going to be looking at that relationship today in sort of 3 different sections of text. So Will and Emma, what were you sort of investigating in your residency here, and how does the Ophelia-Hamlet relationship connect to the questions you were kind of asking through your time here?
Thank you so much. Tossing it to me first. Well, something I was struck by listening to that summary is that I think one thing that we're sort of interested in is Hamlet himself as individual navigating the shapes of not only like the play Shakespeare's Hamlet as a whole, but like the various forms of drama that he's being asked by the dramaturgy to participate in. One of our main ideas is sort of like, there's sort of 3 plays to us, and it's sort of 3 plays walk into a bar, and like the first play is this kid is having a crisis of conscience and grief after the death of his father. And so the sort of exploding supernova of Hamlet the kid's consciousness is one thing that animates the play. And then he's also being asked, explicitly asked by the ghost to be in a revenge play, as Rhodri was saying. And if this was a more conventional drama, it would just be a revenge tragedy like many other early modern revenge tragedies, but it isn't. He's also being asked to be in a marriage plot by Ophelia and by Polonius, and in our interests, I think, particularly by Polonius as sort of agent of the marriage plot within the play Hamlet. And those plays all kind of collide into each other in the center of the action. And Hamlet, the character, feels sort of at turns unequal to the tasks of being in those plays, and also uninterested in being in those plays, and unable to participate in those plays. And so I think that's only like partly about the Ophelia-Hamlet relationship, but I think that the Ophelia-Hamlet relationship is one of the strands of the play that Hamlet, in our conception, is unable to or not interested in being part of. Is that a fair way to start, Will?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Should I say more?
Yes.
Yes. So I think that, the first thing, just to try and jump straight into it, one of the things that we have been doing in trying to sort of think about this idea, the sort of large idea of whether Hamlet wants to be in the play Hamlet or not, and what it means to be in a play, and how that sort of idea of falling into form could also be described as a tragedy, or could also be described as middle age, or could also be described as death. And so one of the things that we're interested in is that Hamlet resists the idea of being in the play Hamlet. And one of the ways we've been thinking about that is trying to organize the casting in a way that the play is, there's a sort of weird problem in the play, which is normally you need 12 people because that's how many speak in the play scene. So you have these sort of 12 people, and they normally end up, this is boring, but I'm going to explain it anyway. What normally ends up happening is 2 people end up playing a bunch of small parts in order to deal with this problem of 12 people. And what we wanted to do instead was sort of try and make this idea that the world Hamlet lived in was inescapable, that he had that the casting could become a formal problem. Does that make any sense? It sort of constantly, people became the person that you didn't want them to become. And then, so his father, the ghost of his father, becomes the player king. He reenacts it again. And historically, and I think I learned this the other day, I think I'm right, Michael Sexton told me, he then also plays the gravedigger, and it's with Shakespeare who played all those parts. And so there's this idea of sort of the fathers. But we're not so sure about the fathers, and instead we were sort of interested, and this is going to lead somewhere, in the idea that the gravedigger, which is sort of in a way the love scene of the play, they're 2 people who get each other's jokes, which is how we know people are in love in Shakespeare. And we thought, well, what if that was Ophelia? What if the scene that is denied, one of the things that happens in the play is that Hamlet and Ophelia are denied the scene that we sort of want them all to have. And we thought, well, what if we did that with the gravedigger? What if the moment in which Hamlet is most escaped from being the play Hamlet is also the moment sort of most away from life? And so we were like, oh, let's have Ophelia play the gravedigger, and so that when Hamlet comes back in Act 5, he's not just the timeline in Act 5 is really weird. Hamlet appears to be 20 years older than he was when he left, and 4 days have gone by. So the timeline is funky, so you sort of have to address that. So we thought, let's have Ophelia play the gravedigger and see what happens, if Hamlet sort of if you could meet the future, but it couldn't be the future, what would that feel like? Because that sort of feels like the play. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense.
Oh, good. It was close for a second there.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, one of the things about the play is how logic breaks down within it. And that becomes especially true in Acts 4 and Acts 5, where, as you put it, no one understands what happened with Hamlet and the pirates. He suddenly reveals in an offhand line that he's an expert swordsman, and that this entire time while this play has been going on, he's been in constant practice with a rapier, which makes no sense. We don't know, the time is out of joint. I read this essay once where someone was trying to figure out like what season the various parts of Hamlet are in. You can't figure it out because there's contradictory. Rhodri, how does this sort of breakdown of logic, this breakdown of a external reality, kind of reinforce what Hamlet the play is doing for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just a little one about the graveyard scene first. I mean, this is speculative. I mean, the scene begins, right, with the lead grave digger showing that, he really likes the sound of his own voice and getting one over on everyone. And he's doing his little sidekick over with his supposedly proficient legal Latin, which actually makes no sense at all. He gets it all wrong. It's messed up. But the other guy doesn't know that, and he gets to win his point. And I sort of think he can't count either. And that messed up chronology that we get there, because as Will says, I mean, it is this weird thing. I mean, it apparently says explicitly that Hamlet is 20 years older, even though he's been away for a week or so.
Right.
And all sorts of people have had all kinds of very elaborate explanations for what's going on there. But I mean, I actually think they're just, they're indulging in a little sort of numerical BS. Both of them. Hamlet can't count either, on the side of this. But anyway, put that aside. So that's logic collapsing. I think the broader point is at the end of the play, where everything is so confused. Tragedy is supposed, after all this bad stuff has happened, there's supposed to be a moment of recognition, reversal, where everything gets turned around, and then recognition when you say, oh God, it was Mom.
Right.
Or whatever, and you realize what's happened and why you must be punished, and justice and order and all that kind of thing is in some measure restored. And
not this play.
Yeah, Shakespeare does that superficially, but no, not in this play. And I think I go on at excessive length maybe in the new book, not in any of his plays. I mean, he likes playing with the superficiality of the way in which you can tie a bow on these plays and say, yeah, sure, there's an easy moral to be taken from that. But actually, it's some, midwit fool saying it, Albany say at the end of King Lear. And we are supposed to, I think, bridle against, and the first guy doing it is Horatio at the end of Hamlet, and he's got a really hard job, right? Because he doesn't want to freak out Prince Angry, who's just coming in. But he also wants to sort of tell the truth about what's happened to his friend and to the governing royal family, and so he frames it as a tragedy.
Right.
That is over. So chill, Fortinbras. No need to have any more killing. Just, And Fortinbras is fine with that and has this comical ending, saying, yeah, and Hamlet might have been, a really good soldier if he'd lived a bit longer. And it's like, what?
Yeah, totally.
I realize you're trying to say the one nice thing you can think of to say about anybody.
Right.
If you're Fortinbras, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then the play ends.
Totally.
And, what are we supposed to do with it?
Right. Amazing. So let's take a look at this scene between Hamlet and the gravedigger / Ophelia. I think it's sort of deliberately ambiguous in some ways, right? With the double casting. You raised this point, so I do want to emphasize it before we listen to this. This is really one of the few moments where Hamlet talks to someone who talks like Hamlet back at Hamlet. It might in fact be the only one, right? Where there's a shared sensibility between him and the person he's riffing with.
There's the little one at the beginning with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern,
right?
Where they do it, but it's only for a second.
But it's only great, cool, right? So let's listen. Let's listen in. Do you want microphones?
It's up to you.
All right, yeah. We'll boom operate.
I'll trust your criteria of acoustics. Okay. Ready?
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. So just as a side note, I have to ask, Fred and Maia, this is a play where every line is famous, right? And you've got some big, particular, you get to say last poor York, I knew him, Horatio. What is it like to try to act a line that has that much baggage? To approach a text that has this much baggage from the actor's perspective?
Well, something that we did talk about, just to let everyone in on like what this process has been for a week, like something that we did talk about early was the sense of legacy and canon, and what we were saying, what was saying about the kind of meta side of does this character want to be in a play? Then tried to use the awareness of those lines as a way into something active and present, I think, through that. Because there is, we talked, certain soliloquies and monologues, we talked about how the pressure or the presence of past performers is something that you can't really escape. And rather than pretending that they don't exist, attempting to converge that with the characters who are trapped in one way of, that one way being that that there may be something connected in those, but I still don't really know.
And I guess, Emma, I'm wondering, just to build on what Fred said, this thing about the burden of the place, that it is impossible to see this play actually fresh, right? Like the tabula rasa version of this play does not really exist.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's also like that's the project in a way. It's sort of, I was thinking, Fred, as you were saying that, the first conversation that you had with me and Will, you said, we were talking about this idea of Hamlet being trapped in a play called Hamlet, and the sort of increasing awareness that we have, because we all have it, of like when we get to 5-2, the scene, the very last conversation with Horatio before the fight, there is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be not to come, it will be now. That whole thing that you said, a phrase, you said, well, dramaturgy is fate. And I was like, oh, great. He's inside our thinking exactly, which is that dramaturgy is fate. And that Will and I have had a conversation before about how, there is a world in which an actor can enter that scene, maybe in our supposed eventual production. Maybe there is a world in which an actor can enter that scene and not move, and we still know how the scene ends. He doesn't have to participate in the fight. He's going to get stabbed at the end of that scene, because that is how the play Hamlet ends. And so, there's a world in which, I don't know, Will, if you want to, if it's too weird to talk about the projections idea, but the thing that is in my mind is like, we've had a conversation about whether or not you directly invoke that history of previous Hamlets by like, if Hamlet walks into the fight scene and the entire space is sort of wallpapered by like silent living projections of all previous productions of Hamlet, so that like you, not only do you watch him die, you watch him die 50 times across the entire sort of 20th century and before of performance. You know what I mean? Because that's the thing. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Will.
I mean, one thing that struck me was that we could probably go around the audience and everyone could tell us the story of Hamlet, and that you're sort of that is also the problem of being Hamlet. That it was interesting to hear Rhodri's description of it as a sort of series of as a sort of a story of a person and a series of sort of in history. Yeah. And what's odd about it, of course, is that's both. It's true, and then it's also not true, because we know, we think we know, unlike history, how it's going to end. And I think that's been a thing that we've been sort of involved in from the beginning. Is this is a play that we've both known our whole lives, that everybody knows, and you're sort of stuck. And what do you do if you go through that fact, rather than, you're either stuck with King John where nobody knows anything, or you do Hamlet where everybody knows everything, and it sort of seems to be the only two choices in a way. Other people might know King John, I don't. So I think that the question you asked, Fred, is sort of part of our thinking about, is as everyone says, is to not pretend that's not true, but instead to sort of say, but why is why is it what's interesting about it if you let it be true, if you let the audience come in knowing Hamlet, what do you then get to do with their knowledge? You know, that one of the things, this is a slight jump, but it's it's sort of adjacent, so I'm gonna use it, is that Harold Bloom says in his essay in Hamlet that Hamlet has no antagonist, has no worthy antagonist. So he's no fool, he has no antagonist, so he's constantly required to be all of those things for himself. He's constantly sort of having to subvert his own expectations. And I read that when I was in graduate school, and it bugged me then. And I was doing a production of Hamlet, and I was like, nah. And I was like, I'm going to be really clever. I'm going to make Claudius really like a villain. So I did, and it didn't work very well. But the problem has stuck with me for 30 years. And I thought, and that's where this idea of like, Hamlet's problem is the play Hamlet. And that's a problem that you share making it, you share watching it, you share acting it, you can't escape from the same problem Hamlet's having, which is that you're in this play called Hamlet and everybody knows how it's going to end. And so that's been a kind of constant idea that we've worked with, and to sort of try and use that as an advantage rather than a thing to work around or to pretend that we're smart enough to find a way that nobody's ever thought of.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Rhodri, you know, you detail quite beautifully in Shakespeare's tragic art the arc of sort of mass opinions about what Shakespeare is and what it should be doing, you know, in the 18th and 19th and then eventually 20th centuries. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there was a period of time where these plays were getting rewritten so that these problems were solved. These problems we're confronting now are solved, and they have a kind of moral lesson, right?
Yeah, no, exactly so. I mean, I agree completely with what Will was saying there. I'd probably cast it in a slightly different language and say both Hamlet and Claudius kind of think of themselves as playwrights who can control, you know, fate as plot, like Iago tries to do, I guess, in Othello. One of Shakespeare's, I think, standard lines is, even if you're as able, and let's face it, both Claudius and Hamlet are very able, even if you're as able as them, that doesn't work because it's all too complex. And that doesn't necessarily mean there has to be, you know, God over there controlling and pulling the strings, but that plotting, the only really plotting authority that can formulate plots is the tragic playwright, you know, viz. Me, William Shakespeare. But going back to your question, I mean, a lot of people, everyone loves the fact that Shakespeare sounds great.
Right.
You know, he writes a good line in iambic pentameter and takes us inside the soul and, you know, all that stuff. The soliloquies, we can all agree. However, he ignores or disregards all the rules of tragic decorum that if you are John Dryden or Samuel Johnson even, and Johnson's a much more open-minded soul than Dryden was, it's a theme of regret at the very least.
In their writing about Shakespeare, you mean?
Yeah, and it's like he's brilliant, but you know he didn't go to proper school.
Right.
If only he'd been able to read Boileau or some French neoclassical theorist. And the fact that he was deliberately, if you like, and to be slightly controversial, giving neoclassical poetics the finger doesn't seem to have occurred to them, because the underlying idea of neoclassical poetics is that there is an order. That catharsis and all that stuff will be arrived at, and we will be, whatever that means, we will be better, more morally centered people at the end of it. And I think the Shakespearean model of tragedy is totally far removed from that, as I would say is Euripides, say, or Seneca and Sophocles in some moods. What they want to do is to just show you stuff as it really is.
Right.
And the challenge is to find an aesthetic form, if you like, and a form of performance through which you can do that without imposing the kinds of what Shakespeare, I think, would regard as spurious order that we expect, and that if you are Dryden, you then rewrite Shakespeare's plays to,
solve them.
Solve them.
Right.
He famously turns Antony and Cleopatra into All for Love.
Right.
Because Shakespeare tried to write a love story, but forgot to exclude all these little bits and pieces.
And in fact, when Shakespeare rewrites Lear, he turns it into this apocalyptic tragedy instead of letting it, Lear get restored at the end. And then later people rewrite him doing that. I was reading Freud essay, because I know how important Freud is to this, but not his actual ideas about Hamlet, which I think are kind of daffy. But is it on psychopathic characters? Is the one where he's like, of course there is another kind of drama that is about neurotics. And the reason why this drama is important is that the neurotic person can watch this neurotic play and see these neurotic characters behave neurotically, and they can thus understand their own neuroses. And the best one of these plays is Hamlet.
Or direct the play.
Yeah, or they could direct the play, right? But the thing, and obviously I don't think that is right, but the thing I think that he is reacting to that you all are trying to get into, correct me if I'm wrong, is Hamlet as the experience of watching Hamlet as mimetic to the experience of being Hamlet in some way, right? Is that accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, in the sense that I think that all of these schools of thought are saying the same thing, which is that consciousness, as it is actually experienced, is too big for drama.
Right.
That actually a mind, the problem with Hamlet is that he behaves not like a character would do, but like a person would do. And that that is actually too big for a play, which is why it takes 11 hours. But,
right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And, to circle back to Ophelia and Hamlet, one of the other things that's going on in this scene is that the grave they're talking about is Ophelia's grave. Hamlet doesn't know it yet, but that's whose grave they're talking about. There's this whole thing where a priest has to be bribed to, like they did with Moliere when he died, a priest has to be bribed to sneak her into the graveyard and say a few words over her grave at night. Every time I watch Hamlet or read it, and I've read and seen it many, many times, one of the things that always surprises me is actually how little real estate on the page their relationship takes up.
Totally.
It's not a lot of scenes. There's huge things that just happen off stage or have already happened. Technically they've already kind of broken up before the play begins, sort of, or there's they're about to, or they're like, hey, you should really break up with that guy now that he's back in town, and then Polonius has to exposit, oh, she actually broke up with him recently. Now how does that change how you're kind of looking at these two characters to try to bring the kind of stuff that's off the page onto the page or onto the stage?
Should we hear 2-1 there? Because I feel like that, yeah, and you're doing so well, Isaac. I'm sorry for showing the strings. But I mean, as a beautiful segue, I feel like we will have more to say about that after we hear it. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So do you want to set up 2-1 for us?
So, I'm the bad. Yes. So before this, so it's always a question, in the beginning, Laertes says, can I go to Paris? And Claudius says, yes. And that's going to happen. And Hamlet says, can I go to Wittenberg? And Claudius says, no. And Laertes comes in to say goodbye to Ophelia and says, look, before I go, just don't with the Hamlet thing. He's got more freedom than you. It's going to end badly. He sort of gives what he thinks of as sort of big brotherly advice. And she says, yes, but you're going to go do that and don't tell me what to do. And then Polonius comes in and says exactly the same thing. So Ophelia has been told to end things with Hamlet, not to end it, to cool it, to sort of rebuff his advances, to stay in her room, because Hamlet has more freedom than Ophelia does, and Laertes and Polonius don't want to get her into trouble. And then meanwhile on the battlements, Hamlet has seen the ghost, has been told what really happened, and says to Horatio and Marcellus, who are there, I'm going to start acting crazy from now on, and if I do, be cool. So that's what we know at this point. And then this thing happens where Ophelia rushes in to talk to Polonius. We've had no more information. That's been the end of the act. Smash cut into sort of Ophelia looking for Polonius, and she finds him, and then this happens.
One of the wild things about this is that it's a description, right? That to me is one of that we do not get to see this scene, which is one of many scenes of their relationship that we do not get to see, right?
Right. We were talking about it when we were working on it with Maia. Will said a really interesting thing, which is we were trying to figure out why it's description and not physicalized, and because the action of her reporting, well, there's so much to dive into here. I mean, the thing I was going to quote was that Will said at some point the quality of Ophelia's attention is really remarkable, and while we have so few scenes of them together, really none except nunnery and a little bit in the play within a play, but the quality of her attention, because one of the confounding things about Ophelia is that she speaks about herself so little in a play where people talk about themselves so much. And her outwardness is really interesting and hard to wrangle, hard to sort of reckon with, because I feel like we're sort of constantly, as like dramatic practitioners and viewers and scholars and people, trying to sort of search for an interiority that she just refuses to project. And what she's doing is like minutely and carefully, as in with care, observing. And so the thing that you said was sort of like, I notice, like I love, therefore I notice, you know, like I love, therefore I pay attention. And so that's one quality of Ophelia that is sort of remarkable. And in the nunnery scene, you get the same thing with that speech after that, that this sort of cataclysmic, or what we're led to believe is cataclysmic thing, has just happened to her. She's been like, you know, rolled over by a freight train, and all of her language is about him and not her. And it's sort of, we wait and we wait and we wait to find out what's inside her, and we only get it sideways in Act 4. I think we do get it, but we get it in Act 4 in the mad stuff, in a sort of, in a kind of oblique, dramatically oblique way. But should we talk about, Will, because your original question, I feel like, that led us toward this scene was about how we're kind of drawing things that are inferred about these characters off of the page into the thing.
And some directors solve that by staging mute
This
scenes,
scene, right, or
in
other
which
scenes.
we see them have sex, or we see
Right.
them, you know, sneaking a kiss, or
Right.
we actually see this moment that she's then describing. Like, that's one way of solving it, right? But that's
Totally.
not what y'all are doing. What is your?
Yeah, I mean, we should talk about the pregnancy. Yeah, we should talk about the sort of undergirded sexual life of this scene.
Yeah, I mean, we should, you know, we sort of exist in the realm of pure supposition, and we take the bits we like. And one of the things that we take that we like is there's a lot of stuff after this scene, particularly from Hamlet, about pregnancy. You know, have you a daughter? Let her not walk in the sun. Conception is a blessing. Most of nunnery, and so we have. In us, I mean, and these are arbitrary decisions, or thought out arbitrary decisions.
Textually supported
arbitrary decisions is the idea that this is, and in a way, it's to do with the distancing of the language. That by sending the language so far away from the character, you create a kind of indescribable act. You want to. We're interested in the space between what happened and how Ophelia describes it, and sort of her inability. If she doesn't say this happened to me, she doesn't, and instead we're left with a kind of poetry. And then because it's a play and you want actions to have meaning, you sort of have to go, well, if it's sex, she might as well get pregnant, because that's more interesting than if she doesn't get pregnant.
And because the sort of messy id of that thought enters the play right after this scene.
Yes.
And suddenly everyone's talking about pregnancy. And that's like the sort of ghost of that is like in the room with us from this moment onward.
But yeah, so to use the formality of this language to sort of the fact of its formality revealing the sort of the chaos of the act, that we can't understand it. We're not given, Ophelia doesn't understand she describes what's happened, but we aren't given access to her feelings, and therefore we can't assume that we know what happened more than she did, or how she felt about it or anything. We can only go by, as I said, the sort of distance of her language. But it gave us the sort of first point of entry into it. So it gives us this idea that, like, now I'm trying to remember your question of like what the relationship.
It's about solving the problem of how much of their relationship, and particularly the character of Ophelia, is actually just off the page.
And it's sort of, I think one of the things we would say is that that's a thing that we find really interesting, and that what happened to me, what happens to others, is we get so caught up with Hamlet. We like Hamlet so much. He has all the soliloquies, he has all the jokes, he has all the clever things, and then suddenly when he goes, one of the original impulses for this play was this question that, like, Hamlet is one of the few people we don't really mind committing murder. That when we think about Hamlet, his great sin is not killing Polonius. We're sort of, or I find myself, I'm okay with it. It's not what I think about in Act 5. He doesn't get his just desserts. It's not the cause of the tragedy in the way that it is for Claudius. And so we get so caught up and so seduced by Hamlet that it's only when he leaves and we see what has happened to Ophelia that we sort of realize what it was like to be seduced by Hamlet, that we are left in the same position that Ophelia's in, sort of bereft, with a father murdered, Hamlet gone, and mad. And so the idea was to sort of work backwards from that idea that if you could you reveal on Ophelia, which is a horrible thing to have to do, but interesting as well. Could you reveal on Ophelia what's actually one of the other ways of reading Hamlet, and reading, again, to go back to that thing about the sort of mesicness of Hamlet, reading our own feelings about Hamlet by how we miss what's going to happen to Ophelia until it happens to her. So that the withholding of and the way in which we fill in the gaps of the relationship is part of what's interesting about it. It's actually to be enjoyed.
Got it. And Rhodri, one of the things about this scene, of course, is it's a description of a costume. Right? It's a very long costume description. And one of the things that I love about Hamlet is if you know the architecture of the globe and you just read the play, it sort of has staged itself already. Hamlet makes very specific references to where on the set things are. One of the lines he has when he's promising to remember his father is the something in this distracted globe.
As long as memory holds a seat in this.
Yeah, as long as memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, which may be a passive-aggressive reference to the audience, right? Or maybe he might be talking about his globe. And when he talks about heaven, is he talking about, the et cetera, and so forth? Why in this particular play is Shakespeare, because he's meta-theatrical all the time. He was an actor. He's very obsessed with those ideas. Why does he push it the furthest he ever does in this particular play, do you think?
It's a really good question. I mean, I have a couple of tentative answers. I mean,
we didn't keep a journal, so we don't really know. But
probably, I mean, one of the answers is that word that Ophelia keeps using in the nunnery exchange, honesty, which, on the one hand, kind of means it's coming to mean what we mean by honesty, which is like inner integrity, or telling it like it is, or telling the truth, more controversially. But for most speakers of early modern English, it means it's something social. It's being regarded well. Honor comes close to it. An identity within this sort of world is something that's seen as social. And one of the standard lines that, this is kind of becoming a boring Shakespeare 101 class, so I'll do this very quickly. One of the standard lines in sort of early modern Renaissance moral philosophy is that the world is a theatre. Right. The theatre of the world, the Theatrum Mundi, with God on top, angels all watching, argument about whether it's a comedy or a tragedy, but needn't go into that. And, us needing to know what our parts are. That is true identity. And that maps onto a whole pile of Roman stuff. And that, I think, is the well, I'm going to be bold, I suppose, and say the quandary for Hamlet, the guy, rather than the play. I have that within which passes show. And yet, fine, you can tell your mom that and go sulking off. But then when he's on his own, it turns out, no, he doesn't have a clue. Right. Sure, there's something inside, but, how I can recognize what it is, much less kind of represent it in some way or another. And that, I think, in a funny sort of way, in a different sort of way rather than a funny sort of way, is the mess that Ophelia finds herself in as well. I mean, she's rather than just being a victim of Polonius and Hamlet, I mean, she is playing a risky hand with real chutzpah here. Mm-hmm. She is faking being lovesick. Right. At her father's instruction, to try and make the object of her affections, show what he really means, what really feels for her, such that, Claudius and Polonius watching from behind some curtain will recognize it, and, then she can marry him and everything's going to be fine. And it backfires horribly. Right. Obviously, because Hamlet instantly, rather than saying, oh yeah, I love you, you can't do this to me, go straight to, off the peg misogyny. Right. Which, that is the third scene we were going to look at today. So maybe this is our great segue to it, unless anyone has anything they want to say before we do this is the greatest hit, right? This is the Hotel California of the Eagles' greatest hits of Hamlet, which is to say the to be or not to be speech through to the get thee to a nunnery scene. This is where Hamlet is being tested by Claudius and Polonius to see if his love sickness over Ophelia is the reason why he's acting this way. They have just hidden themselves. Well, in the Globe, it would have been behind a curtain that was right there, but in other productions, it's all sorts of other places. There's right there for you guys. One of the open questions about this scene
in the many, many interpretations of it is, of course, how aware Hamlet is he's being watched, how in quotes he's behaving, et cetera, and so forth. But in this scene, Hamlet delivers his most famous soliloquy and then is confronted by Ophelia so that they can test him. And the lines between performance and the real get very, very blurry indeed. You want to take it away? So Maia, you've spent some time with Ophelia over the past couple weeks. Can you talk a little bit about what you've sort of discovered about this character and sort of maybe what your thoughts were going in and how they don't always cohere?
Yes, I've sort of liked talking with Will and Emma prior because it was, I mean, even Emma from the beginning was like, you're going to be reading for Ophelia and you're going to be reading for the gravedigger. Like, you are the same person. Like, release yourself from any need to like transform into this like other. Just be you, bring yourself to the thing. We're going to take it slow. And the more I like went deeper into it, the more I had to let go of my like, what's the word? Like preconceptions of like, there's way more love, sincere love between them, I've discovered, and I think it's way more useful to me to not like assume the worst out of their relationship and lean into the love. Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about the to be or not to be speech for a moment, because, you know, when I was studying this, and in many, many things I've read, people are just sort of like, oh yeah, it's about suicide, right? It's about suicide. And in fact, for people who think that Hamlet knows he's being surveilled, the fact that it's about suicide is sort of evidence for that, because he's already given a big speech about suicide. So the question is, why is he giving this second one, and why is it so different than that first one? And it's, you know, anyway, we'll set that aside for a moment, because Rhodri, one of the things that I loved in Shakespeare's tragic art is your argument that like actually no one knows what this speech is about, and any definitive take you have on it actually crumbles if you just sit there and read the fucking thing. And so I'm sort of curious, like, if I want to give you a chance to expand on that, my brief version of that argument, but you know, that among other things, it's dense with illusions that we don't know anymore. It's gesturing towards a lot of stuff that its audience might have gotten that has sort of been lost. Can you unearth some of that for us?
I mean, Hamlet has some big issues, right? He's very unhappy about a range of things. I don't think he knows that he's being surveilled there, but, you know, given that we just don't know, then let's leave that alone. And I think,
totally.
But either way, the point is that he is trying to find a way. I mean, you know, this is one of the first times we're seeing a soliloquy deployed on the stage. Shakespeare's done a couple of them with Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, and does one with Brutus in Julius Caesar. And, you know, Hamlet obviously is a very different game, and it enables us in the audience, to observe, I guess, and to think our way and feel our way inside the way we tend to talk to ourselves. And Hamlet is, I think, there desperately trying to, you know, delude himself in a sense that he knows what's going on, that he understands what his dilemma is, that he's able to exert some kind of control over at least the discourse through which he thinks about and represents himself to himself, albeit that he then has a really hard time making that do something in the play world more generally. I think what we see, though, is that that's kind of, you know, it's an incredibly affective that is, rather than effective. I mean, it's moving. I mean, you know, we listen to this and we get it. You know, he's really grappling with some big questions in the way that many of us do at dark times, but it doesn't actually make sense. And I think it's not supposed to make sense.
And where does the sense break down in the speech for you?
I mean, we could start with the opening line.
Yeah, sure, do it. Yeah.
To be or not to be doesn't make sense. I mean, it's a quotation from a logic book, and it needs to be followed up by something else. To be or be to be
To
or
be
not
what?
to be an angel or a sheep or a goat or a king or something. And he takes the standard line. I mean, he's sort of reading when he comes in to give this soliloquy, and I think we are supposed to infer that he breaks off from what he's reading. And, to be or not to be. I mean, one can go too far down that rabbit hole, which I would not recommend any production do. And then it's kind of knotted together by, associations rather than by, this makes me think of this, which makes me think of that, which makes me think of that, all of which are kind of familiar from, the Renaissance curriculum, if you like, and the Renaissance poetic canon, and he stitches them all together. And just one example springs to mind. Death as the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. I mean, what were you doing with your father in Act 1, Scene 5?
Right. There's one of them has returned. In fact,
it's but that's we're not, I think, supposed to say, oh, Hamlet, you should be paying attention.
Right.
He's emblematizing this guy, who is smarter than most of us, really, and has the freedom as an aristocrat just to, wander around actually really talking to himself about himself. We all have jobs to do. Even he can't get to it. What he can turn out is a beautiful, emotive speech which gives him some sense of cohering, I think, even if that coherence is, affective rather than logical.
Great. And can I ask one question, because you know the early modern sources a lot better than I. Some of the language in this, I'm always surprised. Students are always surprised because they think they know the speech, and then they start reading it, and they're like, "Oh, I actually don't understand what half these words mean." Right? To an early modern audience, as best we know, like when he says, "Who would Fardels bear?" Would they have is that obscure language within Shakespeare's own time?
I mean, it's less obscure than it is now.
Right.
So of course, but I mean, Shakespeare, I think early on decides that he's not going to worry that everyone has to get it.
Right.
When he's doing jokes in Latin or when he's going off on some philosophical altitudo, it's like, yeah, sure.
Right.
Some people will get this, but I'm not going to talk down to everybody else.
Right.
And spell it out. So if they don't get it, and the point again of that speech is that you don't have to get it. And I don't think anyone can. It is the kind of, poetic affective force of a mind trying to assert its own kind of organic coherence, even while, nasty little footnotey scholars like me come along and pull it apart and say this doesn't mean anything.
Right. Right. Of course, one of the jobs of a director is to get it and then to put the results of that getting it. I mean, usually in the way we're trained, right? It's to put the so how do you approach these moments where logic breaks down and stuff? The argument can't necessarily be traced.
I mean, by sort of like deciding what you want it to be and then retrofitting it backwards. But also, there's a couple of things which we've discovered in working on it, which I think are really interesting. The first, and sort of in the dramaturgy of it, is that all the other soliloquies in the play, all of Hamlet's soliloquies before this have come at the end of scenes. And this one comes at the beginning of a scene. So I think we can it allows us to, these are all acts of imagination. I've got no proof of any of them, but so it allows us to think that he is thinking differently, that he's in a different place, because the thing takes place in a different part of the scene. And then, I find, and this is not the answer, but it's sort of that the arrival of Ophelia is sort of the culminating act of the speech, rather than the speech being broken off by soft you now the fair Ophelia. That's actually the sort of, to be slightly romantic about it, there's a sort of leap into love at that point, that he's grappling philosophically, he's grappling sophomorically, he's grappling across various things, and then at a certain sort of, to quote The Godfather, the thunderbolt happens to him, and that's the sort of answer to the thing he's been wrestling with. So rather than it be there's a soliloquy called To Be or Not to Be, and then there's a scene with Ophelia, that if you sort of run the one into the other, and if you look at his language, that first line to Ophelia when he says, "Soft you now, the fair Ophelia, nymph in thy orisons, be all my sins remembered," there's a sort of wonderful like prayer, sex combination thing he's doing. So it sort of allows the end of the speech to lift up into what he hopes and what we hope, although is going to be a love scene, that the answer to be honest to be is all you need is love. Right. And then she says, here's some letters, I want to go home now. And so that's how we're using the speech. So rather, I think, than worrying or paying, in a sense, too much attention to whether or not, to the question of the argument of the speech and the resolution of it, is to think of it as where it fits in the story of Hamlet, the character, that it comes halfway through the play, it comes right before the play, and he's sort of, on either side of this speech, he's much, much madder. At the end of the previous act, the players arrived and he says, the play's the thing in which I'll capture the conscience of the king. He's in full revenge mode. And you think, well, why is there then a speech immediately following it that sort of does the opposite? Mm-hmm. And so that's interesting. So you say, well, you want it to be the opposite, right? Because he just did that. So you don't want it to be the same speech. And then after this, he goes straight from, you can follow his track, and he goes, the speech I play with the players, into the play, into almost killing Claudius, into the scene with his mother, into killing Polonius, and into going to England. So there's a weird sort of gap in the dramaturgy. It would be easier. The play would be more consistent without the speech. It would follow his arc, would be much more consistent if you didn't have this speech in it. If you just went straight to nunnery and sort of more like unhappiness, 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 leading to madness, 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 violence, violence, violence. And instead to use the speech as a kind of break and is there a moment when the play could go differently? And I think there's also a clue. This is a small clue, but it's always interesting. Whenever Hamlet says anything 3 times, he's in a bad way. Well. Yeah, and you're like, uh-oh. So as soon as she says, I've got, how are you doing? He says, well. You're like, this isn't going to go well. So to use that speech, I said at some point in Russell, I always think of it vaguely as an optimistic speech. Not a speech about suicide at all, but a speech in which he ponders suicide, but then ends up in love, ends up choosing love, and then
it all goes to shit.
Yeah, because plot will ruin your life. Right. Dramaturgy ruins your life. That's sort of what happens in the world. So that's how I think of the speech, more than as a kind of what are his thoughts in that? His thoughts are what he is thinking about. There is no sort of further. Mm-hmm. There isn't a sort of explanation behind that.
Did you have a thing you wanted?
Really quickly, yeah. I think that's great. One of the things I often say about the soliloquies, and do it often in the book, is that they're kind of examples of failed intimacy. That failed self-intimacy. You're trying to, but extending that works brilliantly. And I think that, the heart-stopping moment, I think, for Hamlet is right when he says, nymph in thy horizons, which is the informal, friendly lover's pronoun, and she answers with you. And, he knows something is up from that point onward, and, that chilliness, further freezes the chance of any intimacy with himself or with his beloved.
Right, and of course we've lost that sense of that, right? It's like the tu in usted or whatever. We've lost the. You'd have to almost do it in a Romance language. One of the things that comes out here, and it's not the first time, but I do feel like the floodgates really open for Hamlet's misogyny. Right? We've seen it. We've heard it a little bit. Frailty, thy name is woman. But now it's really coming out. And of course, because everything is complicated in this play, his case against women is his case against actors. They wear makeup, they pretend to, and it is an actor playing the part, and he's talking to a boy in a dress, originally, et cetera, and so forth. Can you just talk about how does the misogyny piece fit into, everything else that's going on with what we've been talking about with Hamlet? Because it fits in a lot of different ways, I'm guessing, for you all.
Sure. Do you want me to take that? Yeah. Just one thing I wanted to say about To Be or Not to Be before we leave it behind is that, as Will says, structurally, it's the only soliloquy that starts a scene rather than ends a scene. So it is, as you said the other day, a speech of the morning, which is sort of what it feels like, that he sort of had a sleep. Something that I noticed about it that I think I had never noticed about it before is that all of the other speeches are sort of relentlessly practical, and they're relentlessly eye-centered because they come from plot, because they come from scenes that have just happened. So broken peasant slave is like, oh my God, this happened. How am I gonna? I'm so terrible. I. And there is actually not a single I pronoun in to be or not to be, and it's hugely significant in my opinion. That actually, like, suddenly he walks in talking about not an I problem but a we problem, and it's interesting to me that, like, because I'm sure on a logic puzzle level, perhaps it doesn't make sense and that the illusions don't line up. But on a sort of human, perhaps actable level, it's always felt to me deeply coherent, and that what he walks in and reasons through very in a very down-to-earth way, I feel, is if dying was easier than being alive, we would all be dead tomorrow. And the problem is that we can't imagine, when we imagine death, we imagine sleep, and when we imagine sleep, we imagine dreaming, because we can't think our way out of our own consciousness, and because we would all rather have a consciousness than not. And what Will is saying about it being an optimistic speech is like arriving at the end. I think what we were particularly discovering in the room is that thus conscience does make cowards of us all is a sort of, well, we're all on the hook as much as I am. Like, actually, I'm not a rogue and peasant slave. We're all cowards because we all have thoughts. And we're all cowards, and maybe it's not even a bad thing for the enterprises of great piss and moment, their currents to turn awry and lose the name of action. You know, like, maybe that's actually optimistic and okay, and here's my girlfriend, hey girl, remember me in your prayers.
Well, he'd sure love to lose the name of action in that moment anyway, because he knows that the action he's undertaking is going to lead to his death.
Totally. And so if actually it's not a moment of like great lightness, but like if it's a turn toward lightness, and then as Will is saying, it's an extension toward, oh, here comes my girlfriend. Hey, girl, what's up? And then she says,
here's your shit.
As Shakespeare wrote, hey, girl, what's up? And then she says, here's all your stuff. And the tragedy of the scene, as we've all alluded to, is the fact that it's literally being staged. Speaking of like mimetic playwriting, it's literally being staged by patriarchy. The dads are hiding behind a thing, and this is a scene that neither of these kids wants to be having. Like, she is being scripted, essentially. Right. And so, like, we have no idea. This is one of the, again, just to bang the drum of like the unknowability of Ophelia and why it's such a structurally interesting problem, is because we have no idea what she would actually say if her dad wasn't right there, you know? And so, like, the thing of the fact that the scene starts with, I have remembrances of yours I've longed to redeliver, is like, that's what she's been told to say. And to get back to your original question, I'm so sorry, Isaac, to get the, as you...
Well, no, because the other thing that I do love, I'm sorry, this is very inspiring, is that, of course, then when the men walk back in, they're like,
don't worry about it.
Don't worry.
We heard everything.
We don't need your commentary.
We
actually saw the whole thing, and we could determine meaning for ourselves by.
Yeah.
And she's like, what?
She's like on the floor, and Polonius walks in and is like, no need to tell us what Lord Hamlet said. We heard it all.
Bye.
But the thing about the misogyny is that I'm glad that you brought it to that you likened it to the actor thing, because the word seeming is really like live and electric in this play, and seeming is a particularly feminine problem in the minds of the male characters in this play. And as you say, the thing about makeup, God hath given you one face and you make yourselves another, and seems, Madam, nay, I know not seems, in the beginning of the play, like the idea that women are sort of essentially unknowable because they're at some level performers is a really like bedrock thing in this play, and one of the confounding and sort of like exciting in a way things about it to approach it creatively is that neither Gertrude nor Ophelia allow us any inroads to dispel that idea, really. And so we have to kind of like, Will was saying something earlier about like how it's horrible what you have to do to Ophelia, but like in a way, the kind of discipline of the play is to allow her consciousness to be ruined and to not try to protect her from the dramaturgy of it, to in fact allow it to happen so that you can see the cost of this kind of like charismatic cannonball sort of male intellect. And then when he disappears and the source of our kind of seduction and where we'd like to identify ourselves is gone, it always makes me think, I feel the same about Richard III when you get to Act 4 and sort of like our guy is gone, and then suddenly you're looking at the cost, which is, as always, written on the bodies of women and children.
Right. Sorry, did you have something you want to say, Fred?
Just Because that really inspired something that I feel we were talking a lot about the past week, was the idea of the aperture opening, that of conscious, like you begin and it's like treated in some ways, the way we were discussing it was like Hamlet's the only person who has consciousness and thinks he has consciousness, and he's trapped in this play with all these rote characters, and then gradually not only does he sense his own consciousness, but he starts to extend it upon other people. And I think it's funny. I was just having this thought you're answering two questions that are connected here in what we've been discussing, which is that like the moment of this monologue being the aperture opening,
right?
Him using we. It's a great victory to your point that, oh, I'm not the only one who's alone here. We all are all fully living, breathing people. And then at its most kind of victorious, but also like raw and vulnerable in that discovery, the littlest thing sets that off to be the most misogynist and kind of trapping of, oh, but she's definitely not a real person. You know, like right when you think you're going to have this moment of great connection, it gives you that thing too. And then the other thought that we had this week a lot was the greater crime in the play for Hamlet is not the murder. It's in some ways that his mother is a desirous, living, breathing person who is having sex.
Right,
like,
he keeps being like, you're so old.
Yeah.
You can't have a sex drive anymore. You're too old. It's impossible. Right?
And that seems to plague both Hamlet and the ghost of Hamlet more than the homicide. That's the greater problem is how can a woman have sex? You know, it's like this thing that the play is very obsessive about.
Although to connect to something that Will said earlier, there's a flip side of that, right? Which is that Hamlet's, I think for most audience members, Hamlet's great crime is not murdering Polonius, but destroying Ophelia. Yes. Right? Like the murder of Polonius, we're almost sort of like, well, it's kind of funny, actually. I mean, he was hiding behind the thing. It's like a farce that ends very badly, right? Whereas what happens with Ophelia is just devastating. There's no redemption of it. It is just devastating, right? There's nothing that can come of that. I'm interested because, you know, we've said a lot of, I'm always interested in how actors then have to practically think through all this stuff, right? Because we can talk all day about, well, it's indeterminate. It can be this thing and it can be that thing. Sometimes it's both things at the same time. But as actors, you have to like make choices and then play those choices, you know? Can you talk a little bit about thinking through kind of this in a more applied science way, I guess, both of you?
This is so not applied science at all, but like now we're talking about Ophelia, and sometimes people think of this character like there's something so devastating about her fate, yes, and then there's also something so brave about Ophelia. I feel like she actually gets to do the thing that she's like, you talk about suicide the entire play, well, I'm gonna do it. Right? And like there's something kind of punk to me about Ophelia, and not like, you know, she's often played as this like really lost, wounded like bird that gets smashed in the head. That, yes, that's the case. And also there's her mad scene, her like truth comes out finally. It's like a character that doesn't get to speak for so long and suddenly is like, here I am. And so again, like we've tried to talk like ask questions about like the past of our relationship, like did we have sex, when, how, blah, 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 blah. And then ultimately I think it's been useful just like stick to the text and like this is what's happening right now. I don't know if you want to say something.
I mean, just I owe to your points about like Shakespeare as someone who gives you plot, but also in his writing shows that it's a kind of paltry, pale, like, you know, it's like a rubber band, it's a Band-Aid and not the actual truth. I have found that some of the great discoveries of this week are always the things that you want. It's like the thing that the scene. I'm all over the place, but Will's talked a lot about how like as an audience and also as characters, you're kind of wanting scenes to be a certain way. There's this feeling when Hamlet and Gertrude finally talk that there's going to be catharsis in that, and I think what's really interesting about to your question, putting stuff on its feet, is that you realize so much it's not what you want it to be. You know, none of this stuff is exactly what you want it to be. And so from an intellectual kind of talking around it idea, I think that happens all the time with this work, where you it's helpful to go into it with all of the thoughts, but that's not going to save you. I mean, that's similar to discussions we've had about the play itself. Is like, you can put on a perfect play of a scene and it still doesn't create life and the reality of life. And that's just been like this finding as we worked on this scene, that there's an aspiration towards connection, and yet that's not what the scene is, which feels like you can say what you want it to be, but you have to figure out also what it just is.
Got it. Amazing. We are almost out of time, but we wanted to take a couple questions from the audience, right? So if folks have any questions about what we've talked about, or specifically about the play, we would love to hear them. Not about who wrote it, because there's only one answer. But if we can, it was me. I wrote it and sent it in a time machine. But no, if you have any questions or about anything we've just discussed, or the play in this process, we would love to hear them. We can take a couple now, if you do. Yes.
I think my main question is more about process, and what was the experience of co-direction, and how did that volley work?
Great. So the question is about the process of having two directors in this workshop, and you two have been working together for a long time on this, so I assume that's evolved in some ways.
Always tricky because we might give different answers.
Just talk at the same time.
Okay, we usually do.
You go.
I can't imagine not co-directing at this point. It's so much nicer to be in a conversation with someone than to sort of worry if your ideas are interesting or not, and then have to sort of, but to be like, what do you think? It's a sort of completely liberating experience. You come in, you have these ideas, and I mean, I think one of the things is that, like, we know where we agree and we know where we disagree, and that we know that the answer lies somewhere in the space of that thing, and we're you know, we've known each other a million years, and we're comfortable in that disagreement. And I think so I think, like I said, it's on a very sort of, directing's quite a lonely job normally. You sort of sit there and then everyone goes to the bar and you sit there some more, and it's really nice not to. It's really nice to be like, what do you think we should do? What's next? Is that good? And for someone, you know, you sort of look over and they're fixing a thing you didn't see, and then you fix the thing they didn't see, and then you sort of know that the other, and if they didn't like it, they would just tell you. You wouldn't have to wait. It takes away the secrets, and my hope, and this is a thing I haven't, is that I think it might be quite nice for the actors to sort of hear the conversation, that you're not having to translate, that it sort of opens up the whole room, because you're talking. You know, Emma and I will be standing at opposite ends of yelling at each other, and everybody knows what's going on. There isn't. So that sort of slightly clandestine thing that can often happen when you're directing, that it's like a secret between you and the play that you're hoping you can sort of organize everyone into without telling them. That's sort of taken away, and it's I find it incredibly kind of freeing, and it's nice. It's really nice to argue all the time. Like, it's really nice to be in an argument rather than in a kind of confirming your own theories and then worrying about confirmation bias.
Yeah, I think it's really nice, and it's also harder in some respects. Like the thing of, like, I agree with you totally. I think that's really beautiful, and also it makes you think harder about things because someone is there to be like, you know. And it's interesting because I feel like we should also say practically that Will runs a space in Gowanus called the Mercury Store, which is a lab for directors, and it's a very cool thing. And we have done, over the course of the past few years, the first Hamlet workshop we did was just a week. So we've only ever done weeks single weeks until this process, which was 2 back-to-back. And we have done, since the fall of 2021, which was the first one, I think 6 weeks at Mercury Store, spaced out. So sort of 1 in the fall, 1 in the spring, 1 in the winter, 1 in the, you know. And this was weeks 7 for us, 7 and 8. In the process. So it's been 3.5 years of very sporadic but quite intense collaboration on it. And there have also been weeks in between where we've just gone into a room at Mercury Store and like scribbled on the walls like madmen. And that's also part of it. But So it's been it's been totally unlike any other process I've ever worked on, in that it's been very long standing, and also just sort of like, it's been like slow cooking a sauce for like 100 years, where you're sort of like, we go away and do another thing, and then we come back and we're like, how's the sauce? It's just like, we keep leaving and coming back in a way that I've certainly never done with any other thing. And so the longevity of the conversation also makes it really like unique and strange. And the argument is really cool. I think what you said about it opening up the room is exactly right, is that the actors at Mercury Store and the folks who joined us a couple of weeks ago have, I think, gotten used to very quickly the way that we never stop talking. Like, even when things are happening, we sort of go in the corner and keep talking. And so there's something kind of discursive and alive about the whole thing that it's never like a there and a here. It's like an ongoing loop all the time.
And I watched one of their rehearsals earlier this week, and I will say that's very true. While they were staging the scenes, I was like, this is fucking chaos. Like, it's like people are over there talking, they're doing this, they're like, why don't you go over here? They're re-blocking each other's stuff. And then at the end of the day, you had us just watch everything you had just done over the last couple hours, and it was crystal clear. And that was actually this kind of like, it was like a magic trick you had pulled off on. I mean, I was like, how did that happen? It's really like you see them floating a person, like when a magician does this, and you were still talking through the whole thing, but like the coherence actually did come out of that in a way that I thought was really astounding, to be completely honest. We are kind of...
One question over there.
Oh yeah, one question over there, and then that's...
I was curious how often the conversation kept returning to this concept of gaps, and sort of the gaps in the time of the play and its logic, in Ophelia's self-understanding, in our own understanding of to be or not to be. And Emma, you mentioned sort of the opportunity for gaps potentially in the staging, that the play ends when everyone who's marked for death dies. We don't actually need to see Hamlet fight. We know that's going to happen. So I'm curious if you guys are thinking about sort of the gaps that are textual, and how that potentially provides opportunities for gaps or spaces in staging.
I invented a theory, and it's fully invented, that there's a thing that happens, which is that Hamlet has a son called Hamlet who dies. Shakespeare, the guy who wrote Hamlet, has a son called Hamlet who dies in 1596, and Hamlet is performed in 1601. And in between, Shakespeare has this sort of insane run of playwriting. He writes in the space of a year. He writes Julius Caesar, Much Ado, Henry V. He writes the hits. And I had this idea, which is sort of useful, that all the time he's writing the hits, he's kind of, churning them out. And then at night, he's sort of writing scenes from Hamlet, and he doesn't quite know how they're going to line up yet, but they're sort of on his mind as a way of coping with his own grief. And so if you treat them as and this sort of goes to the acting thing too, if you treat them as fragments rather than as a kind of consistent whole, and allow yourself the pleasure of imagining them as being written in fragments, you don't have to worry about coherence. And so the idea of how you put it together is, in the way we all do in life, that how you are in one scene is not how you are in the other, and how you behave. And that goes back all the way back to the idea of doubling, and to make the doubling intentional, that who people are at any given moment are both your projection of them and sort of who they were before and sort of not. So it provides you, by sort of embracing the fragment of it, it gives you a kind of incredible liberation that otherwise you would have to sort of claim to understand the play rather than sort of intuit the play.
That's an amazing answer. The only thing I would add to that is that, of course, it is also true that the text itself is indeterminate. There is no definitive version of Hamlet. There's the bad Hamlet and no one knows where it came from or why it exists. It might be piracy. It might be, there's the bad Hamlet, and then there's multiple different versions of the text, none of which are definitive. And so when you teach this play or you read it or whatever edition you have, those are editors cobbling that together, from different versions. And so no matter what, there is no fixed version of this thing. And so you might as well, I think, drive towards that, right? Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to this wonderful place, Coffey Street Studios, and to Michael Sexton for organizing this. And we'll be hanging out. thing at the end is pause for the like.
I was like the 50s ones where they all dead.
One's got the pipes. One's got the pipes.